Okay, so on this worksheet we have the same problems that we were working with yesterday in class, but I've already put them into standard form, which means that you can also check your answers from yesterday by looking at what these are set up as the problems today, because I've already put them into standard form for you, but we are going to need to solve these by factoring. So for any problem that we're solving by factoring, we're going to want to see if there is a greatest common factor that we can take out. So for these ones, I would see that each of these would have a 2 in common. So I can divide each of them by 2. And that will give me x squared minus 4x minus 12 equals 0 after I take out that greatest common factor of 2. Then from here, I can factor it using the x method, where negative 12 would go on top and negative 4 would go on bottom, because the last number goes on top, the middle number goes on bottom. When we have just x squared from what we're factoring, the numbers that multiply to negative 12 and add to negative 4 would be negative 6 and 2, which will give me that 2, my greatest common factor, plus the factors x minus 6 and x plus 2 will be equal to 0. Let me make a better plus sign. Will be equal to 0. We would set each of these factors equal to 0, so we can do that up here if you'd like to see. We'd have x minus 6 equals 0 and x plus 2 equals 0. For this one, I would add 6 to both sides, and I get x equals 6. For this one, I would subtract 2 on both sides and get x equals negative 2. So my answers are going to be that x is going to equal 6 and negative 2. For number 2, I can do something very similar. I need to see if there's anything in common with each of these 3 terms that I could take out, and these all have a 5 in common that I could take out. So if I divide each of these by 5, I'm going to get x squared plus x minus 6 equals 0. Again, I'm going to factor, and I have just x squared left in the parentheses after I take out the greatest common factor. So I can factor using the x method, where negative 6 would go on top, and this would be a plus 1x, so a positive 1 will go on the bottom. The numbers that multiply to negative 6 and add to positive 1 are 3 and negative 2. So that gives me that 5 from the greatest common factor, x plus 3, and x minus 2 equals 0. These are the factors. From here, I can see that my values for x are going to be x is negative 3 and 2. X is going to equal negative 3 and 2. Okay, on number 3, I should again see if there is a greatest common factor, but there is not for this one. There is nothing in common to take out, so I can factor straight ahead, go into the x method, where I would put 15 on top, negative 8 on the bottom. The numbers that multiply to 15 and add to negative 8 are negative 3 and negative 5. So that gives me the factors x minus 3 and x minus 5 equals 0, which will give me that x is going to equal to 3 and to 5. Same thing with number 4. I should look to see if there's anything in common to take out, but for this one there is not. They don't all have x, and there's no number in common that they all have. Again, because I have just x squared as the first term, I can solve it with just the x method, where negative 10 would go on top and negative 9 would go on the bottom. I'm looking for numbers that multiply to negative 10 and add to negative 9. That will be negative 10 and 1. So that gives me factors x minus 10 and x plus 1 equals 0. And if these are my factors, I'm going to get x equals 10 and negative 1 as my values for x. Okay, on to number 5. Once again, we can see if there's anything in common. They don't all have x. They don't have any numbers in common. We have just x squared as our first term, so we can solve it with the x method. 24 goes on top, 11 goes on bottom. 8 times 3 is 24, and 8 plus 3 is 11. So my factors will be x plus 3 and x plus 8 equals 0. giving me my values for x will be -8 and -3. For number 6, just like all of these, I'm going to be looking to see if there's a greatest common factor. But 4 and 25 don't have anything in common, and they don't both have x's. So I can factor without taking out a greatest common factor. Here I do have 4x squared, so there's a 4 in front of the x squared. I can't do just the x, but I'm going to need to do the box as well. So when that is the case, I'm going to take this 4, multiply it times the term without x, that's -25. 4 times -25 is -100. And for this one, I'm missing the middle number that would go on the bottom. Right? Normally our equations look like ax squared plus bx plus c. But we're missing this bx term. So if we're missing it, that's going to mean that it is 0. So 0 is what's going to go on the bottom for this one, since we're missing the bx term. So then I'm looking for numbers that multiply to -100 and add to 0. Those will be 10 and -10. But again, because I had the 4x squared, not just x squared as my first term, I'm not done after the x. I need to do the box as well. So I'm going to put 4x squared in the first box, which is this first term. The first term is going to go in that first box. Then -25 goes in the last box. This last term goes here in the last box. And then I used the -10 and the +10 that I got from the x. For these boxes, this will be -10x and 10x. From there, we take out greatest common factors. I'll highlight it so you can kind of see what I'm looking at. But I'm going to see what do 4x squared and 10x have in common. These two would have 2x in common. Then I want to see what do -10x and -25 in common. Those would have -5 in common. Then I want to see what do I want to use the highlighter here. What do 4x squared and -10x have in common? And that would be 2x. And finally, I want to see what do 10x and -25 have in common, and that would be a +5. The one kind of tricky thing to remember here is to remember that because this term here was next to a negative, that makes it negative. So because this is a -10x, when we bring out the greatest common factor, we're going to get a -5 on top there. So these are our factors. We're going to have 2x minus 5 from the top part and 2x plus 5 from the side equals 0. So these are our two factors that we're going to need to set equal to 0. We have, let me make some room for myself. We have 2x minus 5 equals 0 and 2x plus 5 equals 0. For this one, I would add 5 to both sides and get me 2x equals 5. On the other one, I would subtract 5 from both sides and get 2x equals -5. I'm going to divide by 2 for both of these to get rid of the 2 in front of the x. Cancel out that 2. And on the left one, I'm going to get x equals 5/2. On the right one, I'm going to get x equals -5/2. So here my answer is going to be x equals 5/2 and -5/2. Okay, on to number 7. We should again look to see if there's anything in common, but 5, 3, and 8 don't have anything in common, and there isn't x's on every single term, so there is no greatest common factor to take out. Because we have a 5 in front of the x squared, we need to do the x in the box, where 5 times -8 would go on top, which is -40, and then the 3, the middle term, would go on the bottom. So then we're looking for numbers that would multiply to -40 and add to +3, and those are going to be 8 and -5. So then we put 5x squared in the first box. negative 8 in the last box, and then use the 8 and the negative 5 from the x as 8x and negative 5x. Take out the greatest common factors. What these two have in common would be 5x. What these two have in common would be 8. So the first factor that we're going to get from the top would be 5x plus 8. Then for the columns, 5x squared and 8x would have just x in common, and the negative 5x and negative 8 would have just negative 1 in common. Again, because it's next to the negative, this would be negative here. So the other factor that we get is x minus 1 equals 0. Now from this one, the x minus 1, that obviously is going to give me the answer of 1 for my value for x. For the other one, 5x plus 8 equals 0. We would subtract 8 on both sides, getting 5x equals negative 8. Divide both sides by 5, and we'll get x equals negative 8 over 5. Okay, we've got just 3 more. On number 8, once again, there is nothing in common for these 3 terms to take out. So we need to do the x and the box since there's a number in front of the x squared. 6 times 11 is 66. And 25 goes on the bottom. 3 times 22 is 66. And 3 plus 22 is 25. 6x squared goes in the first box. 11 goes in the last one. We use the 3 and the 22 as 3x and 22x here. The 6x squared and the 22x would have 2x in common, and the 3x and 11 would have just 1 in common, so 2x plus 1 is my first factor. 6x squared and 3x would have 3x in common, and 22x and 11 would have 11 in common. So my other factor will be 3x plus 11 equals 0. We need to set these two things equal to 0, so I'm going to have 2x plus 1 equals 0. I'll solve that one by doing minus 1 on both sides, getting me 2x equals negative 1. Divide by 2, and that'll get me that x equals negative 1/2. For the 3x plus 11 equals 0, I'd first subtract 11 on both sides, getting me 3x equals negative 11. Divide by 3, and that'll give me that x equals negative 11 over 3 as well. So x is going to equal negative 1/2 and negative 11 thirds. All right, just 2 more. Number 9, once again, there is nothing in common to take out. Because we have a number in front, we need to do the x and the box. 12 times negative 5 would be negative 60. Negative 17 goes on the bottom. We would have negative 20 and 3. That would multiply to negative 60 and add a negative 17. For the box, 12x squared goes in the first box, and negative 5 goes in the last one. Negative 20x and 3x will go in our other boxes. 12x squared and 3x have 3x in common. Negative 20x and negative 5 would have negative 5 in common, because this one's negative. 12x squared and 20x would have 4x in common, and 3x and negative 5 would have 1 in common, giving me the factors 3x minus 5 and 4x plus 1 equals 0. For the 3x minus 5 equals 0, I would add 5 to both sides, getting 3x equals 5. Divide by 3, and we get x equals 5 thirds. And for 4x plus 1 equals 0, we'd subtract 1 on both sides, getting 4x equals negative 1. Divide by 4 on both sides, and we get x would equal negative 1/4. So x is going to be equal to 5 thirds and negative 1/4. Okay, this is our last one. Again, nothing in common. 4, 12, and 9 do not have anything in common to take out. They don't all have x's, because we have that number in front of x squared. We need the x and the box. 4 times 9 is 36. Negative 12 goes on the bottom. Numbers that multiply to 36 and add to negative 12 would be negative 6 and negative 6. 4x squared goes in the first box, and 9 goes in the last one. Negative 6x are going to go in each of these other boxes, giving me 2x minus 3 on the top, and again 2x minus 3 on the bottom, because 4x squared and negative 6x have 2x in common, and negative 6x and 9 would have negative 3 in common. So this gives me factors 2x minus 3 and 2x minus 3 equals 0. Well, these are the same factor, 2x minus 3 and 2x minus 3, so I really only need to solve it once. 2x minus 3 equals 0. I would add 3 to both sides, giving me 2x equals 3. Divide both sides by 2, and we get x equals 3 halves. So this one would actually only have one solution, because our two factors were the same. Okay, so now we should hopefully be done with each of these problems. I know it was kind of quickly, so if you do have any questions about any of these, feel free to ask. You should be able to also find these same problems in your packet that you may have already worked on before, but if not, you could reference them and use these notes to help you finish that assignment as well.